Good morning, everybody. I'm Jack Welde. I'm CEO of Smartlink. Everybody in the right place? Here to talk about best practices for a multilingual approach to voice technology? Awesome. All right. If you're here for economics class, this is not the right place for you. How's the conference so far? Pretty good? Good. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about voice and about some of the really interesting things happening with voice, and particularly voice that is applicable to people around the world. And so I've got a whole bunch of things I want to talk about data and about growth and about some important considerations around technology of voice and a multilingual approach to voice technology. And I'm going to give a couple different examples of some of the kinds of things that you may want to be thinking about as you are thinking about your own strategy around voice technology, just so I can get a little bit of a sense of who's in the room. How many people here are voice developers, developing things like Alexa skills? Okay, a lot of folks. How many people are on the business side or marketing side? All right, everybody, nice. I like that some of the people are raising their hand twice there. That's awesome. How many people here are focused on Alexa? How many on Google Voice? How many on Siri? A little bit of everybody? Okay, awesome. So I run a translation company, and really I run a technology company that helps other companies to facilitate better, more efficient translation. And you may or may not know this, but translation is literally one of the oldest careers in the world. And I've got a pretty interesting video to start this off to sort of show a little bit of the history of translation, and that will lead us into voice technology. So take a look at this, please. How was that? Let's try it again. It worked in the preview, I promise. Let's try it one more time, see what we can do here. There we go. Okay, I love that video because it has a whole bunch of really interesting technology that if you saw the sort of IBM Electroset typewriter in there and you saw that, you know, when you could actually press a button and it would go back and put whiteout over the letter, you know, 3 times, and then you could go back and type over it. I mean, that was groundbreaking technology at the time. And my company has been focused on helping companies with digital translation, their websites, their mobile apps, their marketing content. And now we're progressing into voice. I think I saw a sign coming over here that said, you know, Forrester or Gartner, somebody says that 50% of the searches by 2022 are going to be done through voice, and I believe that. And so if you're trying to reach a global audience, if you're trying to reach an audience that, you know, for your product, to help people to learn something, to be educated, to interact with your product, to make a purchase, it's really, really important that you are speaking to them in their native language. In fact, the studies show that 70% of people will not make a purchase if it is not in their native language, even if they're comfortable with English. So that's a pretty profound stat, that there's a lot of people that speak English as a second language or as a third language, but 70% of people won't make a purchase. Now think about, if everything is shifting over to voice, how important is it, if you're trying to reach people and engage people and interact with people, that you are speaking in their native language? So a little bit about Smartlink very, very briefly. We're a technology company. We've got about 8 billion words that have been translated in our system. We translate about 1,000 words a minute. These are all human, professional, expert translators. This isn't like a Google Translate or machine translation. We've got about 175,000 platform users, and we do about 2,700 API requests every single second into our platform to say, hey, we want to translate this document or this file or this JSON content coming out of an Alexa skill or whatever the case may be. And you probably know a number of the companies that we work with. We work with brands like Google, like Apple, like Tesla, like IBM, like the weather company, and probably 90% of the apps that you have on your homepage, Pinterest, Spotify, OpenTable, Atlassian, Lyft, you name it. These are companies that are trying to do what? They're trying to reach a global audience, and in order to do that, if you want to reach a whole bunch of people, it's really important that you're communicating in the language that they prefer. And with software and technology, you can generally help to make that faster, more efficient, and less costly. I'm going to skip a little bit about, I'm going to just briefly talk about what we do, and then let's get to the voice stuff. But essentially what we provide is a translation management platform that allows companies to hook up all of their digital content, whether it's content coming out of your Alexa skills content, whether it's part of your mobile app or your web content. We can integrate with all of that, and we can deliver all of that content in multiple languages real time back to the end consumer. And of course, we also work with tens of thousands of professional expert translators that will understand your brand and do the translation. But here's what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about voice technology, and we're here to talk about smart speakers, and we're here to talk about, if you are developing content or skills or anything where people are interacting with your smart device, with voice technology, with your smart speaker, how important is it that that content is in their native language? Super important, right? I mean, nobody wants to interact with a smart speaker if it's not speaking the language that you prefer. And right now, even the smart speakers themselves are not supporting 50, 100, 200 different languages. So already there is a gap, but there's some things that you can do about it. And one of them is to be aware of it. One of them is just to look at the extraordinary growth that's happening with smart speakers in the last few years. This is a Forrester report, and what they're projecting by 2022, that by 2022, 70 million households are going to have smart speakers. I actually think that number's pretty low. I personally have 3 smart speakers in my house. How many people have at least one in their house? How many people have 2, 3, 5? Wow, okay. So, so the fact that there are more and more households that are coming online and that are using voice to interact with their systems, you all know this, that number is going to keep increasing over and over and over. This is one that's a little bit old here, but it was the best data that I could get from, and it came from Business Insider, that talked about essentially the quarterly growth through, I think the last one should say 2017 of Q2. So that's about a year ago, that between the quarterly growth of 2016, when Amazon launched its Alexa Skills program, going from essentially 1,000 to 5,000 to 10,000 to 15,000 Alexa skills, and we're a year later now. My guess is we're probably up to sort of 50 or 60,000 skills that are available through Amazon, or probably even more. So clearly that growth is happening. But let's talk about some of the growth that has occurred in the last decade. Clearly globalization is really, really important, and clearly every company out there that's trying to reach a larger audience, reach more customers, reach more users, have larger networks, they're looking to the entire world. And frankly, there are very few things today, unless you're a small restaurant or a small mom and pop business, pretty much everything that people are selling now online is some sort of digital product that is applicable to everyone around the world. More often than not, what you're selling is something that people want to experience or want to buy or want to participate in around the world. And frankly, those companies that are not global companies are unlikely to be companies for very long. But what else has been driving this and that is contributing to voice? Mobile. Mobile obviously is super, super important. I'm not going to talk to this audience about why mobile is important, but why is it important from a globalization perspective is because in most parts of the world, outside of the United States, for example, many parts of the world, entire regions skipped the desktop phase completely and went right to the mobile device. They don't have a laptop or a desktop sitting on their work office, work desk, or their home desk. They completely skipped that and went right to mobile. And that's really what started the voice technology as well. And so what that means is you have more people around the world that are demanding more language support. And if we hadn't skipped that desktop generation in many parts of the world, in Eastern Europe, in China, in Africa, as just a few notable examples, if we had not skipped that desktop generation and gone to mobile, we might have not had an expectation of as many languages. About a decade ago, you needed about 8 languages on your website to reach 98% of the world. Right now, that number looks more like you need 47 languages on your website to reach 98% of the world. And so everything that's happening with the web that has moved to mobile is absolutely going to happen with voice. We've seen this movie before. Let's just even talk about the growth of internet users worldwide. And so this is some data from eMarketer that's just showing that just in a relatively short period of time, the number of users who have come online or on the internet, that is increasing in the billions of users. And the expectation is that about by the end of this decade or early next decade, everyone who wants to be on the internet is going to be on the internet. And think back to 10 years ago when in many parts of the world, it was really challenging to be on the internet in some places. So we are reaching the point where every single person in the world, forget children and maybe people who are a little bit curmudgeonly and don't want to be on the internet, but pretty much everybody who wants to be on the internet is going to be on the internet. And now they're starting to interact with voice. What's going to be really important? Speaking their native language. I like this chart because this is the latest data from Internet World Stats. It shows the different regions of the world, and what I haven't done here is put the labels, the key that shows these parts of it. So if some of these are North America, Latin America, Asia, Africa, where do you think, what color, go ahead and shout it out, don't be shy, what color do you think is North America where we are right now? Green. Green? Okay, not blue? No. Okay, pretty good guess. What do you think blue is? One more time? Asia, yeah. That's obviously a very, very good guess, and there are a lot more people in Asia, for example, and so you're going to see more of this from here. But interestingly, green is not North America. Another guess? Orange, another good guess as well. North America is actually the 8%. It's the brown in the upper left-hand corner here. So I like this chart, and I've shown this chart in this presentation over the 9 years that I've been running this company, Smartlink, and it's interesting that the blue keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the brown keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So, this is some pretty profound stuff that if you were to say, yeah, sure, I've got a pretty successful business with an Amazon skill that is driving a lot of user adoption, but I think I'll just keep it in English. Boy, you are missing out on a massive, massive part of the market. And this is sort of the wake-up call. And I literally have been showing this back when that 49% was like, 37%, and it was shocking then. But the 8% gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and the blue gets bigger. And other key places like Africa that were originally in single digits have very, very quickly come online and have become very, very important for internet users. So, translation is important. Translation is important. And it's not important in and of itself. It's important, again, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, in the idea of reaching people, engaging people. And my guess is just from this audience here that there's a lot of people that are multilingual and that you have personal experience with this. If you cannot speak the language and you don't feel like that this company that's trying to engage with you, that's trying to sell you something, that's trying to teach you something, is not engaging in your preferred language and doesn't feel like they're right down the street from you, you probably don't want to engage. You probably are not super comfortable with it. So translation is important, and it's unbelievably important when you're actually using your voice, when you're actually communicating with a smart device, with a smart speaker, in a way that I want to be understood. And even as a native English speaker as I am, I know how frustrating it is when Alexa doesn't understand me or when Siri doesn't understand me. And imagine the challenge of that when it's not my native language or it's not a language that I'm comfortable with. And then imagine how that device is communicating back to me to either confirm my request or to give me the information that I'm seeking from here. So this is a very, very big challenge that everyone in this room that is going to have a career that is focused on voice technology is going to have to wrestle with. And the challenge of translation is no one wants to read a translation. No one wants to read something or interact with something and say, boy, I'll bet the original, let's say English, I'll bet the original English was really, really good. This translation is pretty good. Nobody wants to do that. No one wants to interact with something that they feel like is a derivative product, a derivative experience. They want something that feels like it is native, like it is a native experience, a native brand experience from here. So let's talk about a couple of the ways that translation goes wrong and some of the things that are really, really important. Number one, we think that context, at Smartlink, we think context is unbelievably important. And so I have some fairly trivial examples I use, in the context of web and mobile, but I'm going to use some examples here around voice in just a minute. But just to set the stage for context, how many people here speak a language other than English? Awesome. And so if I said translate the word home, and I didn't give you any more information, that could mean any number of things, right? It could mean my homepage. It could mean, where I live. If I'm translating for the Lyft app, for example, is that the homepage of the app, or is that where you're going to drop me off? How about the word cancel? Does that mean the cancel button in a simple little dialogue interface, or does that mean cancel my Lyft ride that I requested a few minutes ago? Both of those, two completely different words in English, and those are unbelievably trivial examples. Let's take a slightly more, interesting example that's a little bit longer, something like I went into a bank, and if I were to say, hey, all of the multilingual people here, go ahead and translate I went into a bank, you might come up with some variation on, I went into a Chase bank to go to the ATM or cash a check or something like that. But what if you were a pilot? Well, now you're talking about turning your airplane, right? I went into a bank. And if you were a sailor, you're having a very, very bad day, right? So three different contexts of the exact same sentence. So how do we think about that? How do we deal with that? Well, one of the things you can do is you can actually provide that context in a web or mobile experience. And so here's an example of someone translating inside of the Smartlink tools for a website. And I think you can see where I'm going to go with this. I'm going to go to context problems in voice in just a minute, but this is where you can actually see exactly how the translation is going to appear and exactly how it's going to fit into that limited screen size of a website or a mobile app or whatever else. And this is where you could see if home is right above my shipping address, I know that means where I live. If home is in the upper left-hand corner above the logo, it's probably my home page. Same for cancel, etc. Well, how do you think about some of those things around voice? And so, just pulling some examples off of the Amazon Alexa page where you can be working with Amazon skills in XML or in JSON, there's a variety of different things that are going to be important for translating. If I'm translating something like, what's the weather today? That's not terribly difficult to understand. There's probably only really one typical context for that. But there's a lot of other examples where you're using dynamic information. You're using dynamic data. Send a text to Melinda. Directions to the New Jersey Institute of Technology, those types of things. And so if you were being asked to translate something like this, imagine you were a professional translator and you were being asked to translate some things like this. Directions to placeholder 0, open placeholder 0, placeholder 0 by placeholder 1. How do you even think about translating that? And unfortunately, we can't put the beautiful, pretty picture of your website or your mobile app and be able to overlay this content against that context to help the translator with this. And a lot of times when developers, and a lot of people raise their hands on this, a lot of times when developers are writing content like this, you're not really thinking about how best do I help the translator with this? Do I provide all of the information and all the context and all of the instructions to really help a translator to be able to understand this? And a lot of times it's not your fault. It's that you hadn't really thought about those different contexts. My example of I went into a bank. Maybe a few of you thought about the sailor example or the flying example or the financial services example, but maybe not all three. Does the word survey mean, is it a verb? I'm surveying my customers. Is it a noun? It's the actual questionnaire. Or is it I'm a cartographer surveying something? So context is really, really important. The other problem that is typical of a development process, particularly around voice and skills, are you're also not ordering things in the way that is optimal for translators. You're adding new content at the bottom of your JSON file or the bottom of your XML file, and then potentially sending it off to translation. So if you have bought into the idea that there's a huge, big, wide world out there, and there's a massive part of the market that I need to reach, the next step is how do you be really efficient in your process? So, I don't know if you have any idea what some of these things are. Like, what's the last one, for example? Well, it could be anything like this. Directions to New Jersey Institute of Technology, Open Recipes, my Recipes app, for example, Abbey Road by the Beatles. Without that context, it's very, very difficult for the translator to get it right, and that's what leads to some of the funny examples that people have seen. It's usually not a problem with the translator who's working really hard out of his or her home. It's usually a context problem that goes into this. And some of them are, I actually thought of a better example on my way over here. Directions to placeholder, getting directions to placeholder. Sometimes the nature of language and the syntax of language and the way adjectives fall either before a noun or after a noun, or how verbs and objects interact that are different. In the US, we would say something like dog bites man, and in Chinese, it might be closer to something like dog man bites. And so how do you think about things like, instead of saying, great, getting directions to the New Jersey Institute of Technology, instead it's, in another language, it might be the equivalent of, quote, directions to getting, or something like send a text to Melinda. And in another language, the more appropriate way of rearranging this might be to Melinda, send a text. And when you add those kinds of placeholders, plus the actual payload of what you're trying to communicate to your smart device through your voice, and to be able to get that content back, this becomes really, really challenging. Context is key. And so I would say, again, buy into the idea there's a huge wide world out there, and I think you probably do by the fact that we've got a number of folks here that are attending this session and others, and you want to reach people in their native experiences. But once you've bought into that, think about what are all the considerations of some of the complexities and nuance of language, and how I, as an Alexa skills developer or some other voice technology developer, can better support this. Because at the end of the day, you want a great experience for your customers. And these are some of the really big challenges associated with it. So super interesting times for all of these various devices, and there will be more. And you'll see it on every single mobile device, as you know, and there's plenty of other sessions here that will talk about the unbelievable growth around voice technology and so on. But what I would encourage you to think about is, this is your market. This right here is your market, the entire world. There's a massive opportunity here. We've seen this movie before. We saw it with websites. We saw it with mobile apps. It is unlikely to be different in voice. So I would say, embrace it now. Any questions? Yes, hi. Yeah, so that's a good question. I'm going to try to paraphrase it back for anybody that didn't hear it, and you tell me if I got it right. I think your question was, or your point was, hey, maybe translation isn't a great example for voice because different countries, different languages may have different interaction styles and different experiences for it, and that thinking about them as completely different experiences for different customers rather than translating one to another may be a better approach. Did I get that right? Yeah, so I think that's a great point, and it probably highlights something that I didn't cover, is that what I'm not actually suggesting, and I would actually I would say don't do this, would be some sort of real-time translation process that is a very literal and very specific and very exact translation for how you would interact with voice between English, French, Russian, Chinese, Hebrew, etc. I would not be advocating something like that. In fact, what I would say is there are probably a set of commands and a set of responses, and I'm trying to be generic and not talk about how Amazon does it or how Siri does it or how Google Voice does it, but there are a set of commands and a set of responses that are going to be typical, that are part of your dictionary of the types of strings and codes interactions that you have. Now, you may have a greeting in English that may include, hello, and in French it might be bonjour monsieur, something even more, perhaps, more extensive than that. But at the end of the day, I think the commands are all very, very similar, and it's all going to probably turn into some sort of XML version or JSON version, and then you have the flexibility to be able to expand those rules and collapse those rules and expand those particular translations and content to meet the particular needs of your customer. The most important thing I think you said is, in my opinion, is it's not just the translation itself, it's a fully localized experience that is appropriate for the local, for that local audience, and I agree with that. Thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
I'll stand up. Oh, perfect. Even better. I'll stand up to project. David Thompson from Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago. My question is a little bit more specific. It's around verb conjugation. And so, of course, I've got a perspective from a patient standpoint, but this could apply to, I guess, any Alexa skill. When Alexa or a voice agent is talking to a person or a patient, you can conjugate things in different ways. You can conjugate it in a second person like a you, or a third person like a he or a she. When it comes to you, in English, we really only have one version of that verb, at least since about 200 years ago. But now if you go to Germany or Spain or other places like that, there's different ways to translate you. There's a formal tense and there's an informal tense.
Yeah.
So this is kind of specific. Do you have any recommendations around using formal tense when we're talking to you as from Alexa's standpoint, or using informal tense?
What a great question. So, by the way, I only had 30 minutes on this, and so we just literally scratched the surface on the topics, but I love that question here, because what it's really saying is, if I go back a couple slides here, to, again, these sort of simple examples here, and imagine that, as the gentleman said, that this was including things like the word you, or some other sort of conjugation where the subject or the verb or the object all have to match up. And I'll give a couple different examples that are related to that. Any Russian speakers in the audience? Any Russian speakers? Awesome. Then I'm not going to screw this up too badly. So I've got a bunch of Russian developers that work for me, and what they've explained is that, and this is something we don't have in English, is if I have a prepositional phrase like I went to the bank, I'm in the bank, I have an office above the bank, I'm driving by the bank and around the bank. In English, that word bank does not change. But in Russian, that word bank adds an extra character or two at the end of those words, which is unusual to a native English speaker. And the question that the gentleman brought up was things like formal you and informal you. And you're right, in English, we don't really have great words for you. And in some languages, there are an awful lot of different variations of this. There's a really interesting case study of pilots in Korean Airlines, and there was a point where Korean Airlines was having a number of crashes, and they brought over American pilots, and they studied all the tapes, and one of the things they found was this very deferential you, that the co-pilot was speaking to the senior pilot, and was speaking in one of these very deferential, one of the 6 or 7 different forms of you, that it ended up sounding like, Captain, wise Captain, I wonder why we're flying so close to that mountain, rather than saying, hey, you, let's not fly so close to that mountain. And one of the very first things that the American consultants did was they said, English in the cockpit. Everything is English in the cockpit. Now you've got one form of you, and you can't be that deferential about how that works. So this is a real issue, and it's a real problem. And now that I've put a little more background in it, to bring it home to your question here, I think if you go back to these things like this, I think that what we always recommend to do translation is not just, hey, let's just translate it. There's a lot of complexity to it. You need a style guide. Are you speaking in a formal way because it's a medical application and you don't want it to come off as informal or flip or something like that? Or do you want it to be more connecting with people in some sort of way? What are the styles that go into it? What's the key terminology that define your brand, that define the things that you care about? You're from a medical community. There's probably, tens of thousands of key terms that need to be translated in a very specific way and then need to conjugate back to that particular form. These are real challenges. They can be solved, but the way that they're solved is through a fairly formal documentation, the description of how do we want to communicate in all of these different languages. I love that question. Thank you. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
How do you take into consideration different accents? That was it.
Different accents. How do you take into consideration different accents? Boy, that is a really, really tough one. I have a friend who has a very, very thick Kentucky accent, and she is constantly complaining about Siri. And then her second complaint is, isn't Tim Cook from Alabama? Like, he should know better. So that's a really, really challenging problem. If the accent is more like US English versus British English, or a language locale variant, there's a decent amount of, there are standards for different locale variations by language and country, but you can absolutely drill into all the way down to, particular dialects of a particular region of a state or a country or different parts of a country. I think generally none of the smart devices really support that, and honestly it's a lot of work to get to it. That's a really challenging problem as well. Thank you for the question. Any other questions? Okay, I think we're probably out of time. Thank you so much for attending, everybody. Thank you.